Thank you, Jim, and thank you, David, for inviting me to this. David Simon, as many of you know, is one of the leading scholars in this field, and it's when I saw the invitation, I really wanted to respond. Every year at the UN, the commemoration of the genocide is marked, usually in some combination of ceremony and substance, but I think it's quite an important day for the organization, reflecting on some of its less propitious times and some of the times where saying why was it so inactive and why did so many people seem to be looking in other ways even when they were looking at the same conflict, but not looking for the genocide. I would try to be fairly quick. I want to say a couple words about the recommendations from the independent inquiry in 1999, headed by Ingvar Carlsson, a former Prime Minister of Sweden, looking at the UN's action, or as I say, inaction, in the case of Rwanda, and what has happened in those particular areas since that time, and then just say a few words about the responsibility to protect and how I think it is or isn't doing it at this point. The independent inquiry was something that wasn't requested by the General Assembly. It was not requested by the Human Rights Council. It was not requested by the Security Council. It was something that Secretary General Kofi Annan at that point felt needed to be done. And I think it was something very, very personal for him because he was the Undersecretary General in charge of peacekeeping operations at the time. And he has sent, if you look at the history, a number of cables at that point telling Romeo Dallaire, the commander, sort of to cool it, and watching very carefully the mandate given by the Security Council, which was rather narrow and not expand it too much. And I think it's something that's lived with him to this day. And so he decided on his own that there ought to be an independent inquiry into this. And I think everyone since, and I know his successor, Ban Ki-moon, from the very beginning, did not want this on his watch. He did not want any genocides on his watch, and it was something that he carried with him as part of this legacy, and that's why the UN championed the responsibility to protect, and that's why I ended up doing a lot of work with him for a number of years. The independent inquiry is worth reading, if nothing else, to see sort of the inside story of what didn't happen and why, though Samantha Power and many other people have written very eloquently on this. But they had three recommendations I'd sort of like to focus on first. The first was that the UN needed a system-wide strategic approach to genocide and genocide prevention. It simply didn't exist at that point. Even the High Commissioner for Human Rights was a relatively recent innovation at that point and not well integrated into the system as a whole. And when people looked at Rwanda, they looked at UNAMIR, the UN peacekeeping operation. They looked at the effort to implement the Arusha Accords. They looked at it as one more civil war situation that had to be dealt with in fairly standard terms of mediation and ceasefires and zones and separation of forces and one thing or another. And through even into the really some of the most intense part of the crimes, there is still this tendency to say, well, okay, what permission has the Security Council given us? What kind of leeway do we have? What is this little operation UNAMIR allowed to do? And a real effort on the part of many member states, the U.S. included, and pushed very much by Belgium in particular, to say, let's pull it out because it can no longer do the sort of peacekeeping mission that it was set up to do. And neither party is really respecting the Arusha Accords. And so the focus really was very much on peacekeeping, not on the nasty business of atrocity crimes. And that mindset was very, very difficult for the organization. So I think one of the lessons that people did draw from this was that you needed to have genocide prevention and then eventually responsibility to protect at the table. When they're talking about options in a particular position, I often say you're not going to get the right answers if you don't ask the right questions. And people weren't asking the right questions in Rwanda because whatever was happening in the streets, whatever, was just sort of messing up their paradigm of what this was all about. And so I think very much the genocide, then led to the creation of the post of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. That originally was a post that was part-time and at the Assistant Secretary General level. And then later, when Ban Ki-moon came in, he said, no, it should be full-time and it should be elevated to the position of Undersecretary General. But in the meantime, the responsibility to protect came along. And I'll talk about that more later. But the decision was you should have two special advisors, a joint office, one focused just on genocide, the other focused on a wider range of atrocity crimes, including not only genocide, but war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. That those may, in fact, be precursors to genocide. And in fact, through the years, Francis Ding was the special advisor for the prevention of genocide, and we worked together for many, many years, and we must have looked at 50 or 60 different situations around the world. Some of them, of course, came up week after week after week in your analysis. Others sort of came and went with crises. We never saw what either of us really thought was genocide. We saw a lot of crimes against humanity. We saw a fair number of war crimes. We saw a few cases of ethnic cleansing, but nothing that looked like true genocide. And the Rwanda standard in terms of the immensity of the killings and how targeted they were sort of left in one's mind, even though genocide doesn't have to be hundreds of thousands, but it left this perception that this is a very, very broad and deep crime. The second recommendation I wanted to point to is they talked about the UN needing an early warning system. And I think it was somewhat false understanding, but people thought, officials just didn't know what was going on. And if they had early warning, somehow they would have headed this off, that would have made all the difference. I don't think that's actually true. I think people had some idea, at least, of what was going on. And it was more a question of assessment and understanding and analysis rather than simply hearing that there is a lot of violence going on. But nevertheless, that became part of the lore in the UN. And in the early part of this century, a great deal of effort on early warning systems. And then when the summit happened in 2005, the World Summit, and they adopted the responsibility to protect, one of the first recommendations in it, wasn't a recommendation, it was a decision by all the heads of state and government, was that all the member states should assist the UN in developing a better early warning capacity. And that's been sort of ongoing. I argued, and I think it's in some of the Secretary General's reports, we did one on early warning and assessment, that really it's that assessment piece that is really the critical part of it. Actually understanding what you're seeing, following the dynamics in which a society is going through, and not taking sort of isolated snapshots, which early warning in some ways sort of implies. Now, there's a new twist on it now, which could be important. So far, it's mostly rhetoric. But just in recent months, the UN has adopted, and Secretary General has become a very big advocate of the idea of rights up front. And that didn't come only from the experience in Rwanda or Srebrenica. It also came in many ways from Sri Lanka, and really rather searing experience in Sri Lanka. That you needed rights, and you needed as the most egregious rights violations, atrocity crimes, right up front in your thinking. I recall actually the only time I was ever shut out of a meeting of the policy committee, the top group that the Secretary General posted together in policy, was when it was Sri Lanka, because people just didn't want that R2P perspective. They just didn't want to focus on atrocity crimes. And the humanitarians were dominating the discussion internally, and that discussion was all about humanitarian access and all about humanitarian space. So if you're going to tell the government that we think you're on the verge or beginning to commit atrocity crimes, that might close down some of the doors and the communication. So the humanitarians didn't want us troublemakers at the table. And I think now they sort of regret that. So rights up front is a new approach. Now, the third thing that they recommended, and it's rather a long part of the report, was really a renovation of peacekeeping. Because in many ways, they looked at UNAMIR, this little force there, and looked at this as a failure of UNAMIR and a failure of the Security Council not to give UNAMIR the right kind of authority and right kind of a mandate. And I do think we have seen in peacekeeping a considerable evolution from that time. At that point, there was a sense that peacekeepers basically had a set of instructions. If citizens, civilians were being killed beyond their immediate perimeter, that was unfortunate, but they were not to extend themselves. In Rwanda, some peacekeepers did extend themselves. I think of the Ghanaians in particular, and many lives were saved. But on the whole, the mission was not nearly as assertive as it might have been. And initially, the Security Council reduced the size of the mission when the violence started. But you look at more robust peacekeeping now, and it's becoming quite common. Most recently, you look at the Central African Republic. It's a little late, but it is more assertive. Chapter 7 mandate, the same in Mali, the same in the Eastern DRC. And you're seeing some results from each of these. Even in Somalia, which was on the agenda forever and ever and ever, there was significant movement towards a more assertive kind of force. So it's making some difference. Now, on the responsibility to protect, at the time of the genocide, you had basically a school of thought about humanitarian intervention. It was pushed by Bernard Kouchner and some others, seen as something of a French concept, but it was something of an all or nothing. If you see these kinds of crimes breaking out, even if you have to cross a border and the government is the culprit, sovereignty shouldn't stop you. You should have every right, in fact, a duty and obligation to intervene and intervene militarily. That obviously was not terribly popular with most of the member states, especially small ones that were worried about their sovereignty. It was not at all popular in Washington either, as Jim may or may not comment when he talks about capitals. But that was sort of the paradigm in which people looked at what you do in a humanitarian emergency. And because it was all or nothing, the answer was usually nothing. A little after the genocide in Rwanda, Francis Deng and some others at Brookings, Roberta Cohen and some others, developed this idea as sovereignty as responsibility, that part of sovereignty is having a responsibility to protect your populations, not just citizens, but the populations on your territory. After Rwanda and then after Srebrenica, Kofi Annan then encouraged the creation of an independent commission, largely Canadian funded, headed by Mohamed Sahnoun, former foreign minister of Algeria, and Gareth Evans, a former foreign minister of Australia. And they were looking at the problem of sovereignty and international intervention. So it was sort of the old paradigm. Sovereignty is the problem, intervention is the solution. What could you do sort of to bend sovereignty a little bit? And they came up with this idea of responsibility to protect. In many ways, it was like Francis Deng's earlier idea on sovereignty as responsibility, but it was finally accepted at the World Summit in 2005. And then when Ban Ki-moon came in, it was the first effort to actually create a living, breathing doctrine, institutional form, and actually apply it operationally. And I had the good fortune to be able to try to do that. And I think it's important to think of the three pillars within R2P because they're all very relevant to what happened in Rwanda. The first pillar is state responsibility. All the heads of state and government agreed that they would protect populations, not just citizens, but all the populations on their territory by preventing genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, as well as their incitement. And the incitement piece was very important operationally because incitement is often a big part of the problem, as it had been in Rwanda. But there's a second pillar, and these pillars are all to be enacted simultaneously, not sequentially, that there is an obligation by the larger international community to assist the state and the society in terms of preventing these kinds of crimes. And there, we didn't see really any significant international action other than some NGO efforts and a few human rights efforts to try to work with the people of Rwanda before the genocide to try to build the kinds of barriers that would make this kind of violence less likely. But that second pillar is enormously important. It has to do with development aid. It has to do with what kinds of institutions you're trying to build, what kinds of legislation, what you're doing with international human rights and other agreements. And it can be very much a in some ways, an invasion of sovereignty in an early way to try to go in and help societies reshape themselves. And the third pillar then is a response pillar. But it isn't necessarily just military. It might be, as it was in Libya, but it could be many, many other ways, including sanctions, including diplomatic, and including some very quiet efforts. And let me just say a word or two about the track record to date, and then turn it over to Jim Traub to talk about capitals. I think we applied responsibility to protect in the years I was in the UN probably to 10 or 12 different situations. Most of those got zero publicity, and they were not supposed to get publicity. A few of them did get publicity. Most people think of Libya because the Security Council picked it up and authorized the use of force, and they think of Syria as a case where it didn't do that. But I think there are many others, like Kyrgyzstan, which looked like ethnic cleansing, which one was able to intervene diplomatically and quietly, along with the OSCE, the High Commissioner for National Minorities, to help discourage violence there. Guinea was another case in point. Ghana twice. It was the first time we applied it in 2008, before we even had the first speech even on R2P hadn't been given, but it looked like a time for prevention. It looked like ethnic cleansing, and we were very much worried about Rwanda all over again. So both Kofi Annan and his mediation on behalf of the AU, and the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, when he went both to the AU summit in Addis and to Kenya itself, the same message was given to both the leaders of the opposition and the president, that your people are inciting what could very well be atrocity crimes. Accountability has to be upheld, and you could be liable. And this has to cease and desist. And the incitement stopped. It wasn't the only reason the violence stopped, but it had something to do with it. And again, it was a question of coordinating the AU message and the UN message. There were a number of other cases, I think Cote d'Ivoire, where R2P was very relevant. Was some use of force at the end, but I think it made some difference. And a number of other cases that are probably a little quieter. Obviously, we had major failures. The Eastern DRC, it's working a little better now, but when I was there, it was not working terribly well. Somalia wasn't going terribly well. And obviously, Syria, in which I spent so much time. The concern was there. The intention was there. The tools never were there to move it forward. And obviously, Soviet-Chinese vetoes didn't, the Russian and Chinese vetoes didn't do anything to help. So looking at this, it seems to me there is another side here, just mentioned in passing, the question of the individual responsibility to protect. I think it's very, very relevant to Rwanda. I think it's relevant to a lot of these other cases. If the responsibility to protect is only seen as outside intervention, as external action, it's going to fail probably more often than it's going to succeed. Most of the places where we had success, it was because there were internal forces, internal dynamics, civil society of one sort or another, that in fact gave you something to build on. And that R2P should be seen as a bottom-up exercise and not just as a top-down. My wife is a psychologist, and we're working on this together to try to develop the question of the individual responsibility. It's not enough for people in the society to say, well, things went terribly wrong, why didn't someone save us? It's first and foremost, responsibility lies within that society, and I think that has to be recognized. But it sometimes takes some nourishment from the outside. Now, the question I guess we all have to ask, if the same events of late 1993 and early 1994 were to happen to Rwanda again, would the reaction internationally be any different? I was there at one point in 38th floor, just coincidentally, that's the floor the Secretary General was on the day when the Belgians were saying that they were withdrawing their troops, which really undermined the mission. I remember the atmosphere there, and I was there from an NGO, UNA USA, but the feeling that there was just no choice. The big powers didn't want the mission. Some of the non-permanent members of the Security Council did. And the Belgians, the former colonial power, and the backbone of the force said no matter what, they're pulling their forces out. And a sense of resignation. And there was a sense of a different legacy, the legacy from Mogadishu and Black Hawk Down and the movement in Congress to pull forces back, and President Clinton, in his decision to make very, very restrictive the times that U.S. would commit forces to peacekeeping. The atmosphere is just as negative as could be. So I think, yes, there's a lot more machinery in place. I think there's international standards concerned, partly because of R2P, much more prevalent and higher visibility than before. But in the end of the day, if things really get nasty, is the Security Council going to act? And are the big powers willing to get involved? That, I think, remains a $64,000 question. And that's the one that I know Jim Traub is now going to answer for us. But thank you.